My name is Dana Reinert. I am the Director of Strategic Advancement and Communications in the Department of Otolaryngology. I have 15 years of grant experience, and today my goal is to help you think about different things that you could be considering as you chase grant opportunities, polish your grant proposals, try again after rejection. If you are joining us again, and we're here last week, thanks for coming back. If you missed the Grants 101 talk, I'll just make a plug for the Ascend website. They are posting the recordings of these sessions so that you can go back and watch them anytime. And my PowerPoint slides are available there as well. The goal for this talk would be to do the same, post the video as well as the slides, so you don't have to take intense notes. And I'm going to just kind of roll along and take questions at the end, but I also want you to know I'm on campus and available, so if you grab me after this and you want to talk, I'm always happy to do that. You're also welcome to email me or call me anytime. I like talking about grant stuff. So today we're going to talk about kind of not the first wave of just learning about grants, but how do you really make your grant proposals fundable and understanding what's allowable and such. I don't know, the keyboard's not working, but that's fine. Just for a moment, if you would tell me a little bit about you, would you please raise your hand if you have ever been a PI on a grant? We've got at least one in the room. Ever worked on a grant project that was federally or externally funded? Okay, we've got a few. Excellent. Raise your hand if you have not been involved in a grant project or proposal process before. All right, there's probably some that are kind of in the middle ground. That's excellent. Hopefully I'll have a little something for everyone. Today we're going to talk about leveraging partners and commitment letters. In NIH terminology, support letter is usually what they call that, but letters that document the commitment. We're going to talk a little bit in detail about developing a proposal budget and some of the do's and don'ts and things to watch out for. We're also going to talk a little bit about kind of the guidelines, both institutionally and as well as for funders, in order to make sure that your proposal is in kind of grant speak, fundable, allowable, and reasonable. And then we're going to talk a little bit about polishing the proposal package. And while I do have 2 degrees in English, I promise I'm not going to spend any time on grammar. So we're not going to be going there today. Just know that you need to make sure you've got everything looking really good and reading well. Here's an overview of the grant cycle. Today we're going to be talking about kind of the end of the pre-award process where you're trying to get to the point where you have a proposal that you can submit that's competitive, and a little bit about the submission process. Maybe a future date we can talk more about the post-award once you've gotten the grant. I want to talk a little bit about the NIH review criteria. I hit on this last week, but I just want to kind of keep coming back to this. So the NIH is looking at significance, the qualifications of the investigators, how you built your team. They're looking for innovation, trying to fund some new developments. They want to know that you have a great approach to what you're proposing to do, and then you have the environment or the facilities in the lab and all the resources necessary to be successful. If you're not familiar with this, I just wanted to observe that the first wave of review after you've submitted your proposal gets kind of an administrative review. So that's one of the reasons why I'm going to talk a little bit about making sure you're following the guidelines, because you may not even make it to the scientific review if you haven't been following basic rules like staying within page limits. There's quite a lot of rules around that, but just know that there's offices on campus that can help with that as well. Our pre-awards office, that's their #1 job, is to help you with that. So make friends with them. The rules may chafe a little bit, but their job is to help you be successful in this. If you've made it past the administrative review and you've had the scientific review and you get scored, meaning that they think that it's something that they'd like to consider, you then have to look at the percentage of scored proposals that they have the ability to fund. In short, do they have enough money? You know, how much money they have to fund. I always like to make a plug here for make sure you're voting and that you're paying attention to what your representatives are doing in Washington, because they are making decisions about whether or not the NIH has money to give out for grant proposals. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about partners. As you think about preparing, formulating your team, kind of the obvious thing is you're going to look internally first. You're going to be looking at the people within your lab or within your group, the people that are in your department. You'd also want to be considering the partnerships that you could be forming across the KU Med campus and within the KU system. I'm highlighting internal versus external because when you are partnering with like KU Lawrence or another KU campus, not just the KU Med Center, if it's a full-time employee, you don't have to have like a subcontractor, extra paperwork. They can just be in your budget as one of your personnel. Students and learners are in a different bucket, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. But you also want to think about the partners that you can pull in from other organizations, whether it's those that have organizational affiliation. If you're not familiar with the EIN, that stands for Employer Identification Number. So basically, is it a formed enough company that they have all of the paperwork in place where they're, you know, doing withholding taxes and all that sort of kind of official organizational stuff, versus individuals who don't have an organizational affiliation. Those individuals we consider to be consultants. And again, I'm going to talk a bit more about that as this goes on. Any partners that you have, you're going to need to have a way to document that relationship. So if they say you're the PI on a grant proposal and then you have multiple collaborators, it's often, funders will often ask that you have a letter from them outlining what their commitment to the project is. And when I say commitment, I just kind of, again, want to point out, I use the word commitment because it clearly designates those letters as that's where you outline the commitment, the amount of time they're going to devote to the project, any resources they're bringing like lab space, equipment, that sort of thing. The NIH calls that a support letter, but I'm cautious about using the word support letter because other funders will allow support letters, which are essentially for other organizations outside of the NIH. The support letters are those where they say, this is a great project, it's worth doing, we would really support this, but there's not usually like a formal commitment in a support letter. I hope I'm not muddying the waters there, but I just want to make sure it's clear that if you have a named partner in a proposal, you're going to have a letter that outlines their commitment. For NIH, they call that a support letter. That's going to be your key personnel, so collaborators on your project, as well as any external partners. So if you have a subcontract with another organization where they're participating and they're getting some money, you're going to need to have a letter, usually from the authorized organizational representative of that organization. So here at KU Med, our authorized organizational representative, AOR, is Jamie Caldwell, over in the Research Institute, or his designee. There's also often a request for some type of a cover letter. I'm circulating in the room a letter example. By the way, the examples that I passed out, I either have permission to share them or they're open access that you can get off of the internet. The letter I'm circulating, I actually wrote all of that. I was the lead for the project, so falls within my intellectual property realm. But essentially, you are likely to have a letter that outlines basically what you're proposing to do. And I'll give you a little more information on that as well. So here is a letter template that generally I follow when I'm helping to write them. I had a ghost on the last slide because oftentimes letters are ghost written by other people. So if you need a department head letter, it's probably the assistant or someone else in the department that's doing the bulk of the writing for that or preparing the letter. That's not a problem. Like, you just want to make sure you have a high quality letter, and then whoever is signing it needs to make sure that they're like actually signing off on what's in the content of the letter. If I'm working with outside or collaborators or anyone else, I will often start the letter for them, which I would always recommend that you, if you have a collaborator and you're asking them for a letter, that you provide them with the basic details so that they can be sure to include that information in their letter. So I gave you a template here so that you can see, you know, you want that letter to hit on the purpose for writing. So that's going to be any commitments that they're promising, so their time, effort, any resources, but also you want them to specifically name the funding opportunity that you're writing to, the FOA, as well as the project title. That's how reviewers will know that it's a fresh letter, it's specific to the proposal. It's okay to recycle letters in the sense that you have kind of the broad outlines that you maybe use from letter to letter. You may have sections like little paragraphs that you plug into letters depending on the purpose of the letter, but I would always recommend that you have a fresh letter for fresh letters for every proposal that you submit, because that's a clear sign, if you don't, that you're recycling basically. I'm going to shift to budgeting for a little bit. I honestly think that budgeting can be really kind of boring or whatever, but I think it's also really exciting because the budget is the window that clearly shows what you're proposing to do. So if you have an opportunity to serve as a reviewer, I would recommend that you always spend some time in the budget. That's the first thing that I look at when I serve as a reviewer, because then as I go through a proposal, I can look to see, does the budget match up with what's being proposed? If there's not money to back up what you're saying, then it's unlikely that you're going to have a successful project. I'm going to talk a little bit about 3 different types of templates. I've got them circulating in the room. For those that are watching this online, you can find these easily on the KUMC pre-awards website. NIH as well, you can easily find by Googling. I don't bookmark anything these days because URLs changed really fast. I literally just go NIH budget and then it takes me right where I need to go. So I don't have links on all of these slides. I think that if you do a quick Google, you can find them. And then Cayuse is our internal system. When the NIH talks about using an assist program for submitting a proposal, Cayuse is our system that we use. Every institution has kind of a different one. If you're part of an institution that doesn't have an assist program, you can use literally the NIH assist program. So Cayuse is what we use for that, and I'm going to show you a few screenshots from that. I circulated examples of this in the room, and again, you can get the pre-awards template online, just KUMC pre-awards budget, and it'll take you to it. And I'm going to talk through these details, so if the font's too small, don't worry too much because I'm going to talk you through it. But within our pre-awards template, they're asking for us to document all of the costs associated with the project. So that's going to be both what you're requesting from the funder as well as the match that the institution is providing. So for example, with personnel, you may have a PI and multiple collaborators that are on campus employees. You're going to have to show on there what the total time effort for the project is. And I'm going to talk you through in a little more detail as we go on. But you'll show the personnel that are devoted to the project. You're going to show your collaborators and consultants. In NIH speak, that is consultants and then subcontracts and contractual arrangements. You're going to show equipment, materials and supplies, travel, and then other expenses. By year, itemized within a spreadsheet. And then you're also going to have a justification, which is a narrative description of this information. The good news about the justification for budgets is that there's often not a page limit, or you've got more room in that section to detail why it's really important to have these resources to support your project to enable success. And so while it can seem kind of onerous, because you have to do a detailed budget in a spreadsheet, and then you also have to have that justification narratively, that's an opportunity for you to go, not just that the PI is going to devote X amount of time to a project, but also these are their qualifications and why they're important to be the ones leading the project. Going on in the pre-awards template, you also, if you have any learners, what? Go ahead.
I do have a question with regards to kind of the equipment or supplies. this cost. I understand justifying it, but is there any bonus to, you know, if you're getting things off Amazon to kind of put that information there, if it's paper, if it's iPad, does it matter where you get that pricing?
The source.
So
Yeah.
I buy it off Amazon, as opposed to maybe a lot cheaper than straight from Apple.
Yeah. So the question is regarding the source for the purchasing of any items and how you go about identifying the costs. That's a good point. I actually hadn't planned on talking about that. So let me hit on that a little bit and then I'll try and weave that in as we go on. So you're always going to have kind of on the front end is like your shopping list. Here are the things that I'm anticipating that I'm going to buy, and then you have to figure out where you would procure them from. The university has all sorts of rules around procurement. I can't get it too far into the details, but essentially it's either, you know, if it's in marketplace or whatever the standard systems are for purchasing, you're generally okay to purchase it. And then you can use the prices that pull in from that system. If you're needing to purchase from another vendor, then you have to go through, you know, vendor approval and all that sort of stuff. But essentially, the most basic level, you're going to try and project what the costs are. And sometimes people do put in, here's how I came up with the exact pricing. Some funders will ask for a quote or a bid that outlines how you came up with that cost. You just want to make sure you're paying attention to the page limits and not getting over on that. And then you obviously have to be paying attention to your actuals when you actually pay for them, because if you've got like a year gap between when you propose and when you get the money and you start spending, the prices might have gone up or down or whatever. So this pre-awards template continues going on with tuition for any learners, which is generally optional for most of the NIH opportunities, but you have to pay attention to institutional requirements. So I just went through this a couple of weeks ago. On the KU Med campus, it's not a requirement that you include tuition support and a grant request for KU Med, but for KU Lawrence it is. So if you're doing a joint proposal with KU Lawrence, you'll want to factor that in. You also can build in patient care support costs, and then obviously any contractual arrangements. And I know this is really small, but I have actually kind of typed it out for you on some of these later slides. Here's what it looks like from a Cayuse perspective. So for NIH, most of the funding opportunities will give you the choice to either do a detailed budget, which is what I've been talking about, where you itemize every cost, versus a modular budget. If you have the opportunity to do a modular budget, I always recommend that, because you basically will say, you know, kind of the lump sum request for each of the categories, and then you have a justification for it, but you don't have to have every single thing itemized, which is good for when you actually get the money, because it gives you a little more flexibility. In contrast, the pre-awards, the KU Med template is going to call for much of that detail. So you kind of have to plan, and to, you know, if you say, okay, my trip's going to cost $2,000 or whatever the ballpark is, you need to know generally how you came up with that. It may be because you have a lot of experience with travel and you know how much it costs to go to a particular conference. You've been doing it for years, but you need to be able to back it up. Continuing in the Cayuse budget, these are just pretty much the same categories. I wanted you to be able to see it. I've circulated it in the room. Again, this information is available readily on the internet. And then another view of the rest of the Cayuse template. So as I was saying, in the Cayuse template or any of these for NIH or pre-awards, you're going to then have to have a sub-award budget as well. So if you have another institution that you're partnering with, they will also have to have their own detailed budget that they use to process internally within their organization, but also to provide to us so that we know how they're going to be spending the money. What it ends up looking like, you upload the budget, but then on the lead institution, on the KU Med budget, it'll just look like one line item. Here's what it looks like when it's a modular budget. There you can see at the very top, it's just the direct cost. So that's going to be everything you just saw on all the last screens. So all the personnel, the supplies, everything. It's just one lump sum for the direct costs, and then the breakdown for indirects. I'm going to talk a little bit more about indirects here in a minute. And then you upload your attachments for the personnel justification, any partnership justification, any additional justification as well. All right, so here's kind of the typed out version of what I was just talking about. So when you think about personnel, you need to think about all the people that are on payroll at KU. Again, if they're a learner on the KU Lawrence campus or another campus, those people, involving them in the project is great. It just automatically will trigger a need for a subcontract with the KU Lawrence or other campus. There's a division or kind of a breakout of who your key personnel are versus your other personnel. Key personnel are going to be any of the people that have decision-making authority. So your PIs, your collaborators, usually anybody that's assistant professor and up, director level and up, kind of automatically fall into that category. The other personnel are going to be your postdocs, your research assistants, the people that are assisting with the project that may help with the day-to-day work, but may not have major decision-making power. I gave you a little bit of information about equipment, although I would just say I was really hesitant on putting that on there. In general, equipment is $5,000 plus per unit and a one-year life cycle, but you really need to pay attention to the institutional requirements for equipment and the funder requirements because they can be kind of radically different depending on what they're talking about. You'll usually outline your travel costs, and there again, I would back it up with some detail of, you have 3 trips planned, 2 people are going to go on each trip, they're going to stay there for 5 nights. Probably not 5 nights, but they're going to stay there for, 3 nights. You've got airfare, you've got ground travel. Make sure you're detailing all of that cost to make sure that it's being covered by the grant and that you're not trying to pay for it out of pocket. You can include participant and training support. So that's where I was talking about tuition and such, but also if you have clinical research trials that you're doing and you want to include I don't actually know if incentives is a bad word, but some type of compensation for their time, their travel, you can include that in the participant support area. And any other indirect or any other direct costs, which would include materials and supplies, publications, consultants, subcontracts, and then indirects. I will talk about indirects a little bit, I promise, because people tend to get kind of confused about it. So when you're talking about usually cost share is related to personnel. I'll give a head nod to some other types of cost share. You may have a partner contribution where another organization says we'd like to donate a piece of equipment or space, and that could be considered cost share of an in-kind nature where it's not a particular dollar amount, but it's an in-kind contribution of a resource. You may also have other institutions or organizations that are providing some kind of cost share or match in terms of their personnel time. I'm providing here a screenshot from the cost share approval form. If you do want to request a cost share approval, it does need to be approved kind of up the chain. You'll need to have your department or unit head approve it, and then it goes to the AVCRA, which I don't know for sure, but I would assume it stands for Assistant Vice Chancellor for Research Administration. It's probably Jamie Caldwell too, that signs off on it eventually. But on that form, you're going to show the total amount of effort on the project, how much is being requested in grant support for that time, and then the total match that would be committed. Sometimes funders kind of force a cost share match. In general, I feel like I just need to be honest with you. I feel like most of the proposals my department's doing has some kind of cost share on it. We have kind of a general support from our department head on that sort of thing because we're trying to build our research capacity. But in general, it's really bad for the institution to do cost share because if you're proposing a research project that's grant funded, and then the institution has to pay for a portion of it, it's kind of putting the institution in a tough spot. Some funders kind of force it, and I'll just give you an example. For NIH, if a key personnel make over a certain amount of dollars, then you have to use a salary cap. I want to say it's like $192.50 or $500 right now. I don't remember his numbers very great, but anyway, if you have someone that's making over that dollar amount for their salary base, then you have to use the salary cap that NIH has. And then that kind of forces a match on behalf of the institution because you have to cover the full salary of a person. Another example is if a funder says this grant cannot be used at all for PI time, which I see for smaller grants where it's only like 5,000 or 10,000 or 20,000. They'll often say can't pay for any of the PI time, probably because it can't afford it. But again, that just kind of forces a match on behalf of the institution. Now we had a few questions about time, effort, commitment after the last session. I got a couple of emails about it, so I'm going to talk about that in a bit of detail. I put a screenshot in there from the manual, the pre-awards manual for eCert. eCert is our internal system for tracking time, effort commitments. PIs basically have to sign off on the commitments of the people that are in their lab or that are working on their projects for federally funded projects. But the think project, not individual, I think is a really helpful point, because when you're planning a budget, you're going to say, okay, I'm going to have these people on there and they're going to devote X amount of time to a project. You're going to have to distinguish between the request and the match, like we just talked about. But then you're also, once the money comes in, you're going to have to compare the proposed versus actual. So really common things that happen is a change in salary base. So, somebody gets a salary increase, or you have a change in personnel and then the new person coming in makes less money or more money or whatever. So you do have to think about the amount of money that's available, the amount of money that you're allocating for it. But I always try and encourage you to think more about the time effort that has been promised or committed. You got to kind of jog along with both of them, because you don't want to be too far out of line on either. So if you match the time effort commitment, but then because there's been some kind of a change like a salary increase, then you can't afford like that total amount. You have to kind of watch both of them at the same time. But essentially what you're going to be doing is tracking the amount of time that a person has put on there. So we have our eCert system for tracking this internally, which is basically where it shows what was proposed versus what the actuals are. We have our payroll system. So whoever's handling payroll for your department, make friends with them, because they need to be up to speed on what you're proposing to do. Before you submit the proposal, they can help you plan your budget, because you need to know exactly what the salary base is for each person down to the dollar. So you can't just go, oh, well, I generally know that they make 50,000 or 100,000. You need to know exactly what it is. And even if you ask pre-awards, they'll come back and ask your department administrator or your payroll person. So you might as well just start working with them directly. On the proposal end, you're going to be trying to project that as accurately as possible. And then on the post-award, once you have the money, you're going to be tracking the actuals to see if it matches up with what you were proposing. I had a couple of questions about how do you figure out how much time you're committing to a project, or how much time you need to commit to a project. That's super hard to do unless you have like kind of extensive experience on this sort of thing. So I'll just give you an example. When I first started working as a graduate research assistant, I was soft money funded for 10 years. So I had grant funding that was supporting me in whole, and most of the people that were on my small team. And so because we had multiple sources of money, our lead basically said, hey, we need to figure out how much time everybody's putting into stuff so that we have some idea, not just for the ones that we have right now that we're tracking and kind of matching up with what we proposed, but also as we go forward and we put in new proposals and new bids, that we have some idea of what, that our projections are accurate. So for 2 years, I actually tracked my hours, and it is painful. So like the people that, if you want to do this, or the people that work with you in your labs, just know that it's not fun to do, but once you do it, then that gives you a data set to go off of, so that you can look and you can go, okay, well, these types of projects tend to take this amount of time. You're going to be averaging over a time period. So say you have 5 different research projects that you're working on at any given time, but maybe for like a couple of weeks, you're putting all of your time into one project, and then you shift, and then you're working on maybe 3 projects at a time. You're going to be averaging it over a particular time frame. At KU Med, we're looking at this quarterly, and then you're also going to be looking at it as a team or as a project. So say you lose a particular person that's supposed to be on this project, but then you have another person that is able to kind of backfill and take on that role. that's okay. You can like sub people out. You can make changes within the category of personnel. It's just when you're shifting into other categories like, oh, I can't spend all the money on personnel because I lost people and I have all this budget I need to spend in the next 6 months. If you want to put that all into equipment or supplies, that's going to need to have some kind of approval. All right, so let's talk a little bit about overhead. Overhead can be confusing. On the basic level, it's not. Essentially, you have access to this beautiful campus, these beautiful buildings, all of the space, the labs, the lights, the administrative people that are in your offices. That's what facilities and administrative costs are. So when we talk about overhead, it's F&A or indirects. But those are all of the things that make us successful. They're not project specific. They're there automatically through the grace of other funding sources, the federal, the state government and all the other things that support that. But we have to consider that those resources, we draw on those resources in order for projects to be successful. So what happens for KU Med and other large institutions is they negotiate with the federal government, often with NIH, to figure out what their F&A rates need to be. So we have us individuals, we have zero flexibility or power over this, okay? So you can't just go, I don't want to include it. Like, it's just a done deal. You just need to understand that there is the value that comes with all of it. I put a screenshot up here. Again, you can find this readily on the pre-awards website where you can see what our rates are. If you're doing research, it's going to be 53%, which means that's 53% of the total award is going to be taken by the institution to cover the indirect costs. Again, that might burn a little bit because you're like, I have less money to spend, but just imagine if you had to pay for the campus and the building and the lights and all those things, it would probably cost way more to do that. If it turns out that you're going to end up working at an organization that's maybe a small startup or doesn't have a federally negotiated rate, just know you can either negotiate that rate with the federal government, which does take a number of years because you have to document your costs and then you have to work with them to figure out what a reasonable rate is, or you can itemize your all of those costs as direct costs. So if you're a smaller organization, you don't have all of that, you can go, okay, this is what it costs to keep my lights on, all these things, and then like average it across all of your different types of activities. Funders can cap this. Again, it's just kind of an automatic match, which is not good for the institution, but for small grants, it's not uncommon for the funder to have in the guidelines that you can only have up to 8 or 10% for indirects. When they have that in the guidelines, you have to do it, which means the institution has to approve it. All right, now let's talk a little bit about subcontracts. Again, if you're working with another KU campus and there are students involved, you will have to have a subcontract. Otherwise, I'm not talking about the KU system. So here I'm talking about other organizations. If you want to bring them in to help expand the capabilities of your team, expand your qualifications, help ensure that you're going to be able to do all of the work, usually there's some value added, like there's a reason why you need a subcontractor on there. You're going to have from them a scope of work. Usually that's just like a paragraph or like a 1 page. It doesn't need to be a detailed thing. If you're working with another organization that's going to be your subcontractor, ask them to write it. You don't need to write it for them, but you want to make sure it matches up with what your expectations are. If you want to write it for them, that's fine, but really the burden should be on them to say this is what we're going to be able to provide and we can follow through on that. You'll need to have a detailed budget from them as well. Oftentimes that is both a spreadsheet as well as a narrative budget for them. And then some type of a commitment, agreement, or letter that's signed by their authorized organizational representative at the subcontract organization. Now, sometimes people will say, well, we have kind of a handshake agreement. We've talked about it. We know what's going to, we know what we're going to do. The thing is that if things don't go well, if, people are busy, they can't get the work done, for whatever reason, you do need this paperwork for the institution, for KU to be able to go back and say, look, we're able to provide you with X, Y, Z dollars in order for you to do this work and you haven't followed through. We need some kind of backing for that. I haven't ever seen legal action associated with this, but I've also, like every time I've seen that there's been this kind of paperwork in place. I don't want to get into too much detail about the FNA for the subcontract organization, but I will just say they tend to have their own indirect rate. So you just have to assume that they will, as an institution, take some cut of the subcontract budget for their indirects. And then the total amount that the subcontract is, both the indirects and the directs, for KU is considered to be a direct cost for us. So then we get indirects on that as well. It's up to a certain dollar amount though. I'm not going to get too far into the weeds on this, but I just want to make sure you know that anytime you have a subcontract, you're going to have kind of a double indirect sort of situation. Yes, ma'am.
These cities, I know academics, like other institutions, really, is there an appropriate reason to put them as a collaborator instead of a subcontractor?
So in the personnel category of the KU Med budget, you can only have KU employees. So there's no way that someone that works at another organization could ever be in the personnel category. They could possibly be in the consultant category, which I'll talk a little bit about as well. I do want to make sure, so the one thing that is somewhat in conflict with what I just said about the whole double indirects thing is that when the NIH says that the cap for directs is $50,000 a year or $200,000 a year, when the NIH says that, they're talking about directs for the sub and directs for the lead, not factoring in indirects at all. So on the pre-awards budget, if you have it in front of you, it's the pink line, and it says that at the bottom of it, the pink line is the directs for NIH. So in contrast, consultants are going to be generally they're individuals. Every once in a while you can have a consultant type organization. There's a form that you can fill out to try and figure out what category they fall into. If you have an external partner, it's likely that pre-awards will ask you to fill out that form. One, so that we can be sure we know what we're doing, but two, so that then you have that documentation of how that determination was made. Almost always, pre-awards will prefer that you name consultants and name subcontractors. Well, you have to name subcontractors because you have to have paperwork, but for consultants, they generally want you to name who they are. You want to be able to show their qualifications, why they were selected. Over a certain dollar amount, you will have to send it out for bid. But if it's just like, I don't know, say $5,000 or something for a 1 year period, you could probably get away with a TBD, to be determined. But just know that that could look from the funder's perspective like you don't know who you're going to be working with. So if you already know who they are, you might as well name them. I guess one of the things I will say about consultants is usually if it's an individual consultant, you don't have an indirect cost sort of situation where they have an F&A rate, but they might have weighted fees, which means that, they're saying, my time per hour is $25 an hour, but I know I need to cover, my lights and my space and everything else. So they may say, okay, I'm actually going to charge $50 an hour. So that's where the weighted fees come in. So almost always the indirects are built in one way or another. We have an internal approval process. If you're not familiar with this, I just wanted to give a head nod to the EPRS, which is our electronic proposal routing sheet. The moment that I know that a grant proposal is going in, I fill that out because it gives pre-awards a heads up it's coming. It gives them some basic information. I always save, which allows me to save the return code. This is REDCap, so save the return code and the link before I submit, because then you can go back and make changes at any time. I mean, obviously after you've submitted, they super don't love it if you go in and change things, but that's what they're using as kind of their official feeding their database for information. There's a couple things they request there, like the cost share form that you have to get signed off on, and eventually you'll have to, they take that information, they send it to the leadership to notify them and give them a heads up of time commitments and dollar requests and that sort of thing. Pre-awards has a page that's for frequently requested information. So if you're doing this for the first time and you're like, oh my gosh, they're asking for all of these numbers and all this information, and I don't know where any of this information comes from, it's probably on their frequently requested information page. Also, if you're looking for that information, you're probably filling out a form or something that pre-awards can do for you. So if you hit that moment where you're like, I don't know the answer to this question, reach out. Like, don't try and figure this out on your own. Definitely don't just use your own mailing address as the official address for the institution. Like, there's kind of official information we're supposed to be using there. They try to make it easy for you by having it all on there as well. All right, so just to kind of summarize that section, you're essentially going to be thinking about all of these things to make sure that your proposal is fundable, allowable, reasonable. There's all of these policies and procedures and guidelines to help guide that, and experts that can help. All right, I want to talk a little bit about the program official. I usually call them a program officer, but I noticed that NIH shifted and started calling them a program official. So that's the new thing. But the PO, essentially at every organization, there's probably a lead or a number of people that are kind of the point people for each program. It's in the guidelines. It has their contact information. You can find them very easily. I would recommend that you connect with them before you submit, after you submit, anytime you can. I've done visits to program officials in DC. That's what they do for their job. So don't feel weird about it. This is not like, you know, you're trying to do like, I'm looking for a special favor. This is like an official way for communicating. I have a screenshot here. If you can't read it, then you can see it on the Zoom recording later. But if a funding organization asks you to submit a letter of intent, which is to notify them that you're planning to submit, even if it's optional, you should definitely do it, because you never know. You might get an email back from the program officer where they say, thank you so much, here's all my contact information. Kind of opens up the door to be able to follow up with other emails. Starts to get your name on their radar. I think I said this last week, but I just want to observe that the grant getting process is not always as competitive as you think it is. Sometimes it's who you know. And I definitely think that we can all play that game, get to know the people that are on the review panels, get to know the program officials, network with them, try to connect with them at conferences, because everybody else is doing it and you can as well. Here are some kind of standard brick walls that I see all of the time. If the funding opportunity doesn't have enough money associated with it, then it's probably not worth your time. So watch out for that. If the PI salary is not allowed, then we might run into cost share issues or funding source issues. We talked about that a little while ago. Oftentimes, like travel won't be allowed, or there's a whole list of things that are not allowed. And I have a screenshot of that here in a minute. But you also want to pay attention to F&A, any type of unreasonable timeframes where they're like, you know, this is only a 3-month grant or something just totally unreasonable. Another thing for researchers that I like to bring attention to is that if you're federally funded, then that usually comes with it an open access requirement that anything that you produce or generate in terms of findings be available to the public. If you're working in, I don't know, like cutting edge areas or stuff like that where you don't want people to know what you're doing yet, don't be looking at the federal opportunities, because that usually it's just going to be an automatic thing. Your proposals are open access as well if they're funded. Also, unfriendly reviewers. I think this is really a thing because, so if you do an LOI, that usually means that the funder is trying to figure out what topics and how many proposals they're going to be getting so they can look for experts. If you're working in a field where there's only like 20 people that are experts, you're probably going to know who they are. They're probably your competitors. Just keep in mind who you're writing to in terms of the audience. Like I was saying, this is from the NIH grants policy statement, but you can easily find online what the allowable and unallowable costs are. There's quite a list. So again, a little bit more on audience. You want to think about who you're writing to. It's often people that you know or other experts that are working in your area. You want to be specific because they can see through the fluff. If you're writing to foundations, then it's probably more likely to be lay persons that do not have a technical background. So you want your writing to match the audience, of course. Try to match the funder terminology, and just every once in a while I get questions like, how do I know who the audience is? How do you know who to address letters to? If the funder says write the letters as if it's going to the PI, you obviously know who the PI is. That's one common model. The other would be to just write it to the program official or the reviewers. Your audience is likely to be outlined on the funders' websites or in their guidelines. They're likely to tell you who the type of people are that are going to be reviewing, so you want to watch for that. As you're polishing your proposal, this is kind of like obvious stuff, but make sure you've got, really great research citations that are up to date. They'll help demonstrate your mastery, and you can draw on the expertise of others to say, this is why it's a good idea to do this. If you have any types of attachments, appendices, definitely for budget, I would always reference throughout your proposal, make sure you have references to them so that clues to the reviewers that they should be watching for that information. In terms of editing, just to kind of a head nod to this real quick, again, make sure you're matching the organizational guidelines, make sure you're following their guidelines, no jargon, stay within the page limits. You can get withdrawn at the administrative review stage, and that's not just NIH. Other smaller organizations probably have someone or some kind of a system that they're using to do kind of an initial sort of, here's the ones that followed the rules and here are the ones that did not. Oh, and budget errors is another thing I see all the time. Just having basic math problems or not updating the budget detail and the budget justification. So you change, the people that are on there, or you increase the amount of supplies that you need. Just make sure you're consistent throughout. As I said last time, there's extensive resources available if you're going after NIH funding. They've got application guides for each of the different types of programs, as well as general guidelines across the organization. And here are some of the main pitfalls. This is mostly to remind me if I've missed anything. Deadlines are kind of an obvious thing, but make sure you're giving yourself ample time to meet all of the requirements, both for internal as well as external, for submitting to the funder. If you have a subcontractor or a consultant, give yourself a little extra time, because it's going to take time for you to negotiate the details across the different organizations. And make sure you connect with a program officer. I know I said that before, but I definitely would recommend that. Lean on mentors and other people. I was, one of our junior faculty, she gave me permission to share this story, but one of our junior faculty is looking at going after an R01 for the first time. She's been really successful at getting some of the smaller grants, both internally and externally, but she's like, I don't really know what for sure how to formulate an R01. So she did some research on past awardees at similar program, and kind of cold emailed this person. I think she was really smart in a couple of areas. One, she went after seeking guidance from someone that was pretty far in their career, so that she's not like in direct competition. There's also not an exact overlap in their research areas, but enough that that would kind of catch the attention or interest of the other person. And now they've been developing like a really strong relationship where the more experienced person is sharing her funded proposals, but also giving time to kind of talk it through. She's going to be visiting our campus. So look for those opportunities and help yourself. Oh, but wait, there's more. Imagine that you get really lucky and you get scored really well. And I say lucky because it's not just about the good work that you do, but it's also having reviewers that look friendly on your work and see the value in it. The NIH, once you've been scored, if they're interested in funding your proposal, or if you're kind of on the border, they are likely to do a just-in-time request for information. They're going to want to know, do you have any other funding sources? What are your time commitments for those? Is there any overlap with other types of funding sources for your research? Are you following all the rules for research compliance? Have you done the training? Is everyone on your team up to speed? Do you have the IRB approval in place? Do you have all of the partnership agreements nailed down? So this is kind of a hint that you don't have to have all of this figured out kind of at the proposal stage, but just be prepared for it, because they don't give you a big window when they come back and say, ooh, we're interested. We'd like a little more information from you. You want to have all of this. And this is kind of cut off, but The other thing I have here at the bottom is that if you have any changes, so you have changes in personnel or changes in scope, you want to communicate that at this stage. And also, like, before you accept the award, there's a little bit of a, I don't know if negotiation is the right word, but a little bit of kind of back and forth to make sure that you're on the same page with the funder. You also have an opportunity then to let them know of any new publications. So when you submit a proposal, don't go, okay, I'm just going to sit back and wait. You're going to continue your research, obviously, most people do. You're going to continue to publish and submit manuscripts, and that just-in-time request for information is an opportunity for you to say, here, I've been really productive in the last couple of months while you've been reviewing. Any questions?